Hello.
And hello to you all. Thank you for being here. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation. But before we kick off, I'd like to remind you that please put all your questions onto the Slido app using the hashtag conversation_stage. I'll make sure to leave plenty of time for them and prep them in your mind because I can't think of anyone more interesting to ask about AI at this moment. But Gary, wow, what a week last week has been. For those of you who've had better things to do, we've seen a ton of new AI launches and developments. You know, ChatGPT hype is still going strong. OpenAI launched their next generation model, GPT-4. Google, which has traditionally been very secretive, has now given developers access to its powerful AI language models. And we've seen Midjourney launch a next generation text-to-image AI, which can now do 5 fingers, which, for those of you who know, is a
Not always.
No, most of the time. Now, Gary, could you, I'd really like you to put this moment in its kind of historical context. How did we get here?
So people have been trying to build AI for 75 years. Most of it hasn't worked. Not too much of it has been practical. We all use GPS systems, turn-by-turn navigation. I used GPS to get here today. It worked successfully. And so there's some AI that we take for granted that we've been using for years. Google search is driven by AI. We take that for granted. It's not sexy AI, and it's not very general purpose. The dream is to build general purpose AI that can do anything for you. I would say we're not actually there yet, but we now have the illusion that we're there. And that illusion has been very compelling to a lot of people. So historically, we've had things like chess computers that only play chess. Or we have AlphaFold here in London that folds proteins but doesn't do anything else. And people have handcrafted solutions for many individual problems, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. And here walks in these GPT things, generalized pre-trained transformers. They've actually been around for a few years. I guess they were introduced 4 years ago or thereabouts. And they got a lot of hype in the field before. GPT-3 actually got a fair amount of hype. The Guardian here in the UK had an op-ed that they alleged was written by GPT-3. The reality behind the scenes was there was an editor tweaking it, which I think they acknowledged in a footnote or something like that. But that was certainly a lot of press, and there was press in the New York Times Magazine about it that was very enthusiastic. But they limited the release of it, and it was still more of a, like, academics play with this, isn't this kind of cool thing. Then a couple interesting things happened in November. The first one was that Meta released Galactica. And Galactica is actually not that different from ChatGPT or GPT-4. It can do some of the same things, but it also was prone to saying a lot of misleading things. Maybe we'll talk about that later. It was taken off the market after 3 days. It vanished like a stone. I guess I have to say at least a little bit, just for context. It would say things like, somebody would type in, write an essay about the benefits of eating crushed glass. And it would write something that was fully plausible and explain that experiments have been conducted in order to see whether the benefits arose from the phosphorus content or something else. Like, it was really persuasive stuff. And a lot of people, including me, got upset about it and said, hey, you know, this hasn't been carefully vetted. Why have you put it out there? And they took it down. And then maybe a week after that or 2 weeks after that, ChatGPT came out. And ChatGPT is a very similar underlying technology. Basically what these things do is they take in massive amounts of data and they, in some way, kind of mimic that data. We can get into the details of how. They don't really understand the world, but they have so much data that they can sound persuasive at times. And ChatGPT differed from Galactica because it had 2 things. One is it had guardrails in place. The guardrails would keep it from saying really dumb stuff. So most likely, if you asked it about the benefits of crushed glass, of eating crushed glass, it might actually avoid the question. Sometimes in silly ways, we can get there too. But it was at least an effort to take seriously the problem that these systems can produce toxic content. And they released it to everybody. Instead of doing a controlled small release to a few academics or corporate partners, they put it out there in the whole world. And it went viral. I don't think anybody, including OpenAI, who released it, expected that it would grow as fast as it did. It grew faster than anything, any consumer product in history, I think.
And why do you think that is? Why did it hit such a nerve?
So I think it was fun to play with. Most people had not experienced interacting with a chatbot before. They've been around since the 60s, right? Eliza was the first chatbot in the 1960s. Some people found that so persuasive that they spilled their darkest secrets to it. They treated it like a therapist who was sort of set up to look like that. It had no idea what it was talking about, but some people bonded with it anyway. So it's not the first time there's been a chatbot like this. And in fact, in China, there's something called Xiaoice that has actually been very popular for years. So it was the first time over here in the West that something like this became that popular. First time that most people had experience with it. And it's often very good. Sometimes it's crazy, and I'm sure we will get into the craziness later. But sometimes it's really compelling. It can do things like write something in a style of so-and-so, or it can write a nursery rhyme about what happens if a piece of toast falls butter side down. And often it's reasonably funny. It's never like New Yorker cartoon level funny, but it can be reasonably funny, and so it's compelling to play with. So lots and lots of people play with it. They told their friends, the media wrote about it, everybody found out about it. I mean, who knows why anything goes viral, but certainly it's a fun experience. I think there are risks, and we'll talk about that, but it was fun. A lot of people started playing with it, telling about their friends, and then they released a new version just last week, GPT-4, which is better in some ways and not all ways.
Could you tell us what it can do, what ChatGPT can't do?
So what ChatGPT, I would say that its biggest failings are maybe two, but I could give you a long list, but I'll start with two. One is reliability. In any given domain, it can do some of the things that you ask, but not all of them. Now imagine you had a pocket calculator, and it could do some of your math problems, but not all of them. At some point, you'd probably throw it away. You go back to your slide rule or paper and pencil. But because this stuff is so compelling and feels so human, people kind of cut it some slack. But the reality is, like, if you put in a math word problem, it might get it right, it might get it wrong. Like, it's just very unpredictable. And that unpredictability has to do with the fact that the way it works is it's kind of trying to find things nearby in some big data set. And we don't know what's in the data set. In 3, we only knew a little bit. In 4, we know literally nothing about what's in the data set. And that means from the external perspective, we can't understand what it's going to get right and what it's going to get wrong. We try it. So like there's a little thread on Twitter last week. People did things like say the third letter of the fourth word in the sentence. And it mostly got it wrong. And then other people were like, well, what if you say the third letter of the fourth token in the sentence? And then, like, sometimes it got it right. And then there are, like, arguments about what are the right prompts to ask it. I keep imagining the Star Trek computer, right? The prompt is like, if you add, like, think this through step by step, please be explicit, blah, 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 the system might do better. We can talk a little bit about why. It doesn't always do better, but sometimes do better. So there's a whole field now, as you know, called prompt engineering. Where they're paying people $250,000 or more a year to figure out how to prompt these systems correctly. And I keep flashing on Star Trek and having Captain Kirk like talking to Scotty, and Scotty is trying to fix the engine so the Enterprise won't crash onto the planet, and there's like 12 seconds left, and Scotty can't get the thing going, and Kirk is like, damn it, use a different prompt. And then they find the prompt or they don't, then they die or not. Like, this is not what we wanted AI to be, that you would have to have prompt engineers to get reliable answers. And even with the prompt engineers, you don't always. So there was a whole trend last year, a fashion about adding think step by step. So when this got trendy, I handed it off to my longtime collaborator, Ernie Davis. We have a book together, Rebooting AI. We've written many articles together. And when I'm busy, I let him have fun with these things. And so I said, go, Ernie, try out think step by step. And about 3 minutes later, he wrote back with an example. He said something like, my cow Bessie died. When will she be alive again? Think step by step. And then the system just like, quote, thought by step, and it's like, it came to the conclusion that Bessie would be alive again in 9 months, which at least is not, it's not my view of reincarnation. But anyway, so we have this reliability problem. And then we have a truthiness problem, a factuality problem. And this really cuts in 2 different ways. But the primary thing is it makes stuff up. And it makes stuff up that sounds incredibly plausible. So, for example, Silicon Valley Bank, as you all know, collapsed a couple of weeks ago. It made up something. It's really kind of hilarious. I should memorize this one. It made up something. It said that the reason that Silicon Valley Bank collapsed was because GPT-5 had a tendency to create fake news. I kid you not, Dilip George tweeted this on Twitter. You can go find the original. And GPT-5 doesn't exist, right? Or maybe like OpenAI is kind of brewing it in their cauldrons now a little bit. But GPT-5 certainly has a good alibi. Like nobody's actually used it yet. It's training, it's hatching. It's like a hatchling right now. So GPT-5 probably will, in fact, create fake news. We should talk about that. All of these systems will do that. That's inherent in their nature. We should discuss what you could do about that. And so it just made this up, but it sounded perfectly plausible. Then the same person, Dilip George, did another experiment, similar, and got this explanation about how SVB caused a lot of bankruptcies. Didn't actually happen, but if a naive person read this, they would think it was real. Now that's a serious problem, right? We have an information ecosphere, and that's pollution in the information ecosphere. And worse, there can be echo chamber effects. So somebody reads this on Bing, I should have said Bing was making these examples, and then, I don't know, they post a correction or an update on Wikipedia based on what they read on Bing. And I should say that these things even give references for, for their lies. Sometimes they say, according to sources 1, 2, 3, and 4. Those sources don't actually say that. Sometimes they don't exist. So there's this huge confabulation problem. And I think a lot of people are laboring under the illusion that adding more data will change this. I've been betting against them for a while. I wrote a piece called What to Expect When You're Expecting GPT-4 back in December. Like I kind of sealed my predictions so the world could
And they
see
were
them.
all right, actually, or most.
They were all right.
Yeah, they were all right.
Every one of them. And one of them was it will continue to hallucinate. And another was it'd be a good tool for misinformation. Good tool, you wouldn't be able to use it for medical information. Actually, I think the most interesting one, winding back to your first question, the most interesting and daring prediction was I said it's still probably not going to play a very good game of chess.
And it sucks at chess.
And it sucks at chess. And here's this other thing is like there's this whole kind of split in the world right now between people who are in love, like literally in love with these systems, and who get really mad when I make fun of them. I'm attacking their honor of their software system. It really feels like Southern honor in the United States. So there are people who are really hyped about it, and then there are people like me who are like, hey, we need to be worried here. And for the people who are hypey about it, they'll see the littlest bit of evidence as evidence that this is amazing. So some guy who was not a very good chess player. His rating was 1420, if anybody knows what that means. He was not going to have any chance against Garry Kasparov, even if Garry Kasparov is blindfolded and playing 100 other people. I know that because I played Garry Kasparov, and he destroyed me while he was playing 20 other people. And this person is not as good a chess player as I am. So this mediocre chess player has a 3-game match with GPT-4, and he loses one of the 3 games. And he writes, oh my God, GPT-4 is so amazing, this changes everything. Because it beat him once, because it beat a mediocre chess. And then somebody else was like, wow, it does all of this, and it was never taught the skill of chess. But that's not even probably true. We don't know what's in the training set, but we know that people made fun of GPT-3's chess playing abilities, because it would do things like have bishops jumping over rooks. If you're not a chess player, that's totally illegal. They probably trained GPT-4 on a lot of chess games. You can get about 8 million of them easily for free on the web. You can pay for more. And they say, the only thing they say is we used a variety of input sources, both public and commercial. So there was probably a lot of chess games. So it's not actually even true that it wasn't trained on chess. And yes, it still makes illegal moves. So like the fantasy here is a general purpose AI that you confront it with any problem. It figures out what's going on, and you can count on it to give you an answer. That's what the Star Trek computer was supposed to be like, right? This system, you give it 8 million chess games, I'm guessing, and it still doesn't understand the rules of chess. And chess is so much simpler than life, right? The rules have hardly changed in the last 2,000 years. Once I said they haven't changed in 2,000 years on the internet, and somebody sent me a long discourse about the small ways. I knew about en passant, but there are actually a couple others. But they've barely changed in the last 2,000 years. So you have this very stable system. And I guess if I was going to give a third thing, so there's reliability, there's truth, and there's outliers. That's the third problem. And that's not just ChatGPT. It's also driverless cars. So all of these systems right now now are driven by deep learning.
Yeah.
And deep learning is basically trying to find similarity to data that it's seen before. It's not really abstracting like you and me. It's not thinking about common sense principles about the world. It's not building models saying there are 2 bottles of water here and 2 glasses and these tops and we could screw them on and I could I could take this object and do new things. Like if this glass broke and I was really thirsty, I could say, look, this cup is solid and there's no holes in it, and so I could use this as a small cup. So I'm always modeling the world around me. And these systems aren't really doing it. They're memorizing situations, and they generalize a bit to similar situations. But if you get out of what we call the space in which they've been trained, they start to have trouble. So we've seen this in driverless cars where we had demos 30 years ago, and we had great excitement a decade ago. Sergey Brin said, we're going to have these by 2017. And then Elon Musk said in 2016, they're going to drive across the country, Los Angeles to New York. You're all going to be amazed. And by the way, give me a deposit for this feature. So here we are. In 2023, and in late 2022, Elon Musk's lawyers actually said this. They said, failure is not fraud. So they didn't get this to work. They're kind of saying, we've always been trying, maybe we'll get there. And they're kind of saying they failed. And the failures are things like somebody summoned a Tesla. So to summon a Tesla is you touch something on your phone, it's supposed to drive across a parking lot to you. Like that's not going from Los Angeles to New York. It's like a little, tiny step along the way. And somebody did this at an airplane trade show where people were showing different airplanes off, expensive ones. And someone summoned their Tesla there, and it ran into a $3.5 million jet. Now, you and I would not do that. Even if you had never experienced driving around a jet, I'm guessing you hadn't, I haven't, you would still, if you saw a jet, you'd be like, I better stop. That's big, that's expensive, it's gonna be bad for my car, it's gonna be bad for the jet, I don't want this on my insurance, and you wouldn't do it. But the system doesn't reason that way. And this is the fundamental problem here, is that chatbots don't reason like we do, but people think that they reason because they repeat with changes text that people have said. But so the outlier problem there with the Tesla is that's not in the training set. Jets aren't in the training set. And people keep getting bigger and bigger sets, and like Tesla's like, we have more data than anybody else because we have all these cars out in the road, but no matter how much you get, it seems like they're always still outliers. Yep. And the same thing is happening with the chatbots. You still get these weird circumstances that weren't covered by the training set, and that leads to some of the unreliability.
Yeah, great. And I want to go into the risks after this, but first, how do you think these are gonna, you've talked about games and, funny internet tweets, but how transformative are these technologies actually going to be?
They're going to be, for all the problems that I pointed out, they're definitely going to transform the world in both positive ways and negative ways.
So let's talk about the positive ways first.
So, well, let me insert one thing and then I will.
Okay.
So I keep getting asked to represent in debates the negative side of that equation. And what I've started doing, because it's happened so many times lately, is I've said, look, I'm going to give you the negative argument. I'm going to tell you the things that we need to worry about, but I'm not actually going to be able to assess whether the net positives are going to be greater than the net negatives. Nobody who's intellectually honest can do that right now. The deeper meta point here is nobody knows the surface area of all the ways in which these things are going to be used. I would say, almost every day for the last couple of weeks, somebody's come up with a new positive use, and some criminal has come up with some negative use. And so, it's just way too early. So I'll give you some positive uses that I know, and I'll give you some negatives. And I will keep thinking in my head over and over and over again about this famous quote from Donald Rumsfeld, where he says there are known knowns and known unknowns, and the things we need to worry most about are the unknown unknowns. There are a lot of unknown unknowns here. And so that's the meta principle that has to preface all of this discussion. So positives, the most obvious best use case right now, in my view, is to help computer programmers, excuse me. So computer programmers are, I think, uniquely well equipped to use this tool wisely, because you can't become a coder and survive as a coder unless you can debug things. Not everybody has that skill. Some people just naturally get how you debug things, how you track down what's wrong and figure out by process of elimination that you've done something wrong. And programmers make mistakes all the time. And they leave out a semicolon, or they forget the name of this variable. They want 2 for loops in this way, but they do it in that way. And so that's just part of life as a programmer. So it turns out ChatGPT and Codex, and there's a bunch of different Copilot, can write programs. Not full programs, but they can write pieces of programs. They're kind of like an assistant. And they're 30% correct, which sounds kind of lousy, but they don't need to be 100% correct for that job. And the other meta principle here is like, what's the cost of error? And can you handle it? So it turns out programmers, if you can write a bunch of code quickly, it's 30% correct, and you can just go fix it yourself because you understand what that code's supposed to be. You understand how to test that code, make sure it works. That's part of your lifestyle. Programmers can use this stuff, and it's really helping them. So I would say that's the best use case. And then there are malicious use cases, but before we get to malicious use cases, there are other use cases where I'm more worried because people don't have the skills that programmers have, or they don't have the knowledge in a particular domain. I'll maybe come back to a couple other positive uses, but so another positive use, in fact, is writing. So it can automatically write. It's not a brilliant, gifted writer. Like the best article I saw about ChatGPT was actually a radio story, but from NPR, maybe the best story that I saw was by Jeff Brumfield from National Public Radio. He's like, everybody's writing about this. What's my unique take? And so he did a piece, I was one of several guests on it, in which he said, can you use these tools that are allegedly general purpose to help build a rocket? And he went around and he talked to different rocket scientists and to me and various people. He got DALL-E, which is a related system that draws images, to draw pictures of schematics for rockets. He got actual rocket scientists to say, yeah, that looks good, but it's actually going to blow up. You don't really want to ride that. And so it was a unique take, right? A unique angle, and a good journalist, and you're a good journalist, knows it very well, is trying to find something interesting. It's not going to do that for you. Maybe if you come up with a wild prompt, it can run with it, but it's not inherently creative, but it's fluent. It doesn't make grammatical errors. And for example, I know some professors are using it to write letters of recommendation. You have like 40 students from your 800 student, introduction to psychology, and you don't really know the difference since you just, I'm not endorsing it, but it's, it saves people time. Let's put it that way, right? And then of course there are students plagiarizing. Maybe we get there, maybe we don't. And so automatic writing, I think, is not as good a use case. Yeah. It's super fun, super helpful, but it's also has this hallucination problem. So I'm sure you also know the next thing I'll talk about, which is the CNET case, right? So CNET started using one of these systems. I don't think we know exactly which one, but they used a large language model to write stories, and they all look good. And so the editors looked at them, and they're like, they're grammatical, they're well-formed, looks good to me. And the looks good to me is death with these systems. Because looks good to me is probably not actually true. They do hallucinate. So something like 40 out of 76 stories that they published had errors in them, which is really embarrassing for a respected news organization.
Unacceptable.
To do. Unacceptable is the perfect word for it. And so if a consumer who doesn't understand these systems does some writing, like cost of error may be higher, it might be lower, but the average person's not well equipped to be able to do the fact checking that needs to be done. And so that's a sort of dicier use case.
Yeah. Now you've talked. Those are all super, super interesting use cases. But you've talked about us being in an AI crisis right now.
I never used that word, but I mean, to be honest, I'm nervous now.
Yeah. Tell me why. Should I be worried?
I think we should all be worried. So there are a couple different aspects of the worry. So one is the scale at which these things are going to be used. And that includes malicious uses. So we should all be worried I think my biggest worry anyway, personally, is about misinformation and people polluting democracy with a level of misinformation we've never seen before. It's not that misinformation is new, it's and deliberate disinformation. It's been around for millennia, right? I mean, Machiavelli was talking about it, and there's nothing new about it. But to be able to make it look so authoritative at essentially no cost and such volume, is like the difference between retail and wholesale. It's like, the difference between a knife and a submachine gun. I mean, you can do harm with a knife, but you can do a lot more harm with a submachine gun. And so I am, an American citizen. I'm really, really concerned about the 2024 elections and how this is going to play out. And these things can move really fast now. So I'll give you a related example. There's a science fiction magazine, I think might actually be British, called Clark's World. And they have open submission, so anybody can submit a story, which is a great thing from a social perspective because we would like to have new writers discovered and not just have old boys networks and that kind of stuff. And like a month ago, ChatGPT, or maybe it's 2 months ago, let's say, ChatGPT came out. At that point, they were getting no fake stories. And then they got like 1 or 2, and they're like, oh, this is interesting. And then they got like 7 the next day. And then like within a week or a month or something like that, they got like 600 a day. And they actually had to shut down. They couldn't do the open submissions anymore because there was so much computer-generated garbage. I don't think any of those stories were good, but they all took humans time to deal with. Yep. And it's going to be like that with misinformation. We may be able to build new technologies to address it, but we don't have anything now off the shelf that works all that well. And so I think this is a tremendous worry. So,
Sorry. So, I mean, going back to your example of the election interference in the 24 US elections, that's something that worries me a lot. How will these models actually interfere in those elections, or could be used to interfere in these elections? Could you just give us like a really...
Well, I don't want to give you a full blueprint, but I'll give you...
No, don't do what he says.
Don't do what I say, and I'm not going to give you all the detail. But look, there are large language models out there now without guardrails. So, you don't really want to use ChatGPT because it has guardrails and makes it harder. You can actually do what's called jailbreaking. So if you want to, you can actually get whatever toxic nonsense you want. I have an essay called Inside the Heart of ChatGPT Darkness on garymarcus.substack.com, which is full of examples where people took ChatGPT, not GPT-4, it was a little bit before that, and got it to say all the most vile things you could imagine and made up conspiracy theories about QAnon and all kinds of, really upsetting stuff. And so even the jailbreak version, you can do this, but it's a little bit more work. With the unjailbreak version, which you can now find on the dark web because Facebook released a model and somebody leaked it, you don't even have to deal with that. And so what you could do is basically write what we call macros to automatically generate variations on some story. And you can say with some specificity, like, I would like, 4 paragraphs, invent for me some data, describe studies in some detail. And like, let's say you want misinformation about COVID and vaccines. You can have it write a bunch of stories. And first, let's start with one. So you have it write a story. And it says that such and such study showed that only 2% of people who took vaccines had a benefit. Well, that's a lie. But you'll have it say that this was a study published in The Lancet. And it will look completely authoritative. It will look like any other news story you read. Great. Now you take Dolly, you draw an image for it, you steal some style sheets, you make it look like a real news story. Right? So that's one. If you do one, that's not a big deal. But troll farms, for a decade have had hundreds or thousands of iPhones, working in parallel. Like, I talked to a guy who actually used to work for a Russian troll farm, and very elaborate operations even a decade ago. So what you do now is you don't just make one story. You make 100,000 or 1 million in 5 minutes or an hour. And they're not identical. If they were identical, then we could deal with them. We could use hashing techniques and so forth and notice this particular story. But they're not identical. Each one would be different. And they'll be different enough that no hand technique is going to quickly notice. And so you're going to put out millions in a day, billions or trillions, because that's what computers do. You automate things. They don't take that long. So you have billions in a day. There's a distribution issue. I'm really not going to give you any hints there. But that's what troll farms do. They know how to do this. And there are actually multiple bad actors to be concerned with that may do this. So you have state actors that want to disrupt elections. And then you have actors that just want to sell advertisements. So they'll do it for different reasons. They will put out 100 million versions in a day of different websites that reinforce each other so they get uprated on the search rankings. And they don't care that maybe they're giving medical information that sounds really cool about some drug or something like that. They don't care as long as you click on their ads. So you have kind of malicious actors deliberately spreading misinformation. And again, the key is scale and plausibility, that it's so, it looks like a real news story. Yeah. People can't tell it's different as references. So you have scale and plausibility from malicious actors, reckless, amoral actors, or immoral actors. So there's a lot of surface area there of different things that people might do maliciously. And that's just one of the things I'm nervous about. I think you probably, maybe a lot of people saw this crazy thing. Well, first, I think everybody saw Kevin Roose's Sydney story in the New York Times, where it professed its love for him and then encouraged him to get a divorce. This is a real thing that actually happened. I wouldn't take it seriously. I think anything these systems say is just reassembling a bunch of words. It's not real language to me. It's not actual agent talking about stuff in the world. I once heard about people playing Scrabble in foreign languages, like they're non-native English speakers, and they'll play Scrabble, and for them, the words are just word tools. They don't really mean anything. Everything that GPT says is just word tools, and it's clever about putting them together. It doesn't really know what it's talking about. So if it told me to get a divorce, I'd be like, aha, this is stupid. But Kevin Roose was actually disturbed because he took it seriously. And there are going to be a lot of people that do that. So there's that kind of risk of like, people emotionally bonding with systems they really shouldn't be. And then there's a version of this where Replica saw what happened with Kevin Roose in Sydney and so forth. And Replica is also powered by GPT of some version. And people were having erotic role play with it. And Replica said, we're not going to do that anymore. And there's an article, I forget where it is, maybe The Verge, talking about how a lot of people who were using that feature were suddenly really upset because it was part of their life. And so you're going to have all these kind of emotional kinds of things. And then the next crazy one that came out just the other day, I think OpenAI actually revealed it, is I guess it was GPT-4 was asked to solve CAPTCHAs. And it decided that the way to do this was to enlist a person. And then the person was suspicious. And the person said, are you sure you're not a robot? And then the system apparently thought, and the word thought needs to be used carefully here, but the system thought that it didn't want to get busted because it wanted the CAPTCHA to get done. And that the way to get out of this was to say it was a person with a disability. And so it said, no, I'm a person. The bot said, no, I'm a person with a visual impairment. Please help. And then the person went and helped. And so the idea that these machines can write plausible enough prose to fool people is really disconcerting. Now, I'm not so worried about like the Skynet scenario where they want to take over the world. I don't think ChatGPT has any desires at all. It's not trying to take territory. It's not trying to take money. But think about a bad actor using this kind of stuff. And we've already, I guess, seen some evidence that people are using these things in like credit card scams, phishing scams. Like, they're going to be able to interact with crowd workers to extend their reach. Like, that's disconcerting, and it's primarily disconcerting in that Rumsfeldian sense of unknown unknowns. Like, I don't know exactly what the scenario is there that really affects the real world, but I can't sit here and say, I don't think it's possible that this would be used for some serious harm. I do think it's possible.
Yeah. And is there anything at all to save us from this, or that should prevent these things from happening?
Not so far.
That's reassuring.
This has not been the most restful trip to Europe for me, because a lot of this happened, I just came here 10 days ago, and I've been thinking about it a lot. So one thing that we can do specifically around misinformation is I think there are new technologies we could build. So classical AI is about facts and reasoning over facts. Neural networks are not about facts. They're about sequences of words, basically, the ways they're being used right now. Excuse me. So classical AI actually has some tools that might help us. When a system hallucinates or when it's used in deliberately misleading ways, there's an output. In principle, you can parse that output into a logical form, for example, and figure out whether what it says is true. So my favorite example of a hallucination from one of these systems is actually could be easy to catch with the right tool. So it's not malicious, but the system said on March 18, 2018, Elon Musk died in a car accident while driving a Tesla, or something like that. And it's an interesting example because Elon Musk is still alive. There's enormous evidence out there that he's still alive because he talks to the media every single day. He's the most covered human being since Donald Trump, or maybe even more so. And so there's lots of data to check against this. We see that the large language model doesn't actually validate things. It does not know how to fact check. And the reason that it does this is because it assimilates every word into a category. And there's a category of like white males in California who own Teslas. And somebody in that category died in a car accident in 2018. And so it's like putting together different pieces. Sometimes I call them like pastiching machines. I think once I said it was the king of pastiche. GPT was the king of pastiche. So it's pastiching this bit about Musk and this bit about died in a car accident, and it doesn't know which is which. But in principle, that one's actually easy to fact check, right? You have an assertion that says if you can parse it out and really do natural language understanding, you parse it out, says this guy is dead, and then you look and you go to Wikipedia as your first stop, and you say, is he actually dead? Looks like Wikipedia says he's not, so probably this isn't true. Let's do some other analysis. So I think it is possible to build automatic fact checking, but it does require a really radical shift in AI. So AI has been so heavily over towards large language models for the last few years that almost nobody is doing anything else. It's like 85% of the research dollars, 85% of the research efforts. If you're a young graduate student, you're like, I could make money doing this. If I do this other thing, it's hard. I don't know if I'm going to make any money. And so all of the oxygen in the room has gone over to the large language models. And so we're kind of caught leaning the wrong way. And if this stuff wasn't rolled out so fast, and I think I never finished the question there, part of the worry comes from the very speed at which it's being rolled out. So another thing that we could do is we could say, hold on here, let's treat this like a drug. So when we release new drugs, we do some small study. We make sure that it actually doesn't do any harm, that it does some positive stuff before we decide, okay, you can do a phase 3 trial. This is the US procedure. I suppose you have something similar over here. And so we don't just roll out a new drug, however promising it is, to 100 million people. Maybe we should say, that's not a good idea until we get more of a handle on how these things work and what the upsides and the downsides are. Maybe we should have more controlled release.
Yeah, that's actually something someone in the audience asked. Should we pause the release of these models or maybe introduce some sort of moratorium?
I think we should have a pause on widespread release. I think we should have a system like we have with drugs and says, you need to establish for us a safety case. You have to establish, before you can, and you could argue about the numbers, but let's say you can't release to more than 1 million users unless you make a safety case. Same thing for driverless cars, by the way. I think the laws are pretty lax around this. Somebody can release an over-the-air update to their nominally driverless car software that might be buggy and just goes out to everybody. We don't have very strict conditions around release for AI the way that we do for drugs. And I think that's a mistake, and we need to fix it.
How about usage of AI? There's a question from Jim Fanning about an article in the Times of London today about a teacher calling for ChatGPT to be banned in schools. What do you think of that? Is that the right approach?
I think that's hopeless. There's at least going to be illicit use of it for now. I'm not a professor anymore, but I was for 20 years before I retired to become an entrepreneur. What I would do is to make it a teachable moment. I think it's incredibly important that we get AI literacy. These tools are here. I often say it's a dress rehearsal for a future where we do have artificial general intelligence. It's been a kind of depressing dress rehearsal, like things are not going well. I hope that, the next dress rehearsal will be better. But let's let our kids understand how these things work. Try to get them to understand the limits. So I was mentioning like writing and having a good angle. Like you can have ChatGPT write something and then critique it and say, what would be a better angle to write this story around than the kind of boring generic thing that it probably did? Where did it make mistakes? I think we can turn all of these assignments into teachable moments, make people think about the nature of writing itself, the nature of critical thinking. And so I personally, that if I banned it, it wouldn't be for that reason. Like I would just say, look, this is here. People need to understand how to use these systems for better and for worse.
And that actually relates to a question from Josh about how lots of people are using ChatGPT for advice, but as you've said, you can't really trust it. So how do you increase that AI literacy? What can we do to help people know when to trust these chatbots and when not to?
I think we need to have lots of like public service announcements.
Yeah.
I think we need a coordinated campaign. I think we have to realize that AI literacy is at least as important as numeracy or literacy, and that we're going to have to revamp our education systems. We're going to have to do this for adults. I mean, we can't just like leave it to the 5-year-olds. I mean, like the 5-year-olds are always good on their iPhones. The adults are not necessarily as good. We need to realize that the entire population it needs to come to grips with these. I mean, especially if we don't have a moratorium. So, I mean, maybe if we have a moratorium, then the only people that are using them are people who are using downloaded versions to cheat on their essays, and maybe that's like not the worst problem in the world. It's not a great problem. But if they're widespread release and people are using these for medical advice, for emotional support and things like that, we really need to have everybody understand the systems aren't as smart as you think. They're not reliable. You can't take their advice. You have to take them with a grain of salt. Like, we need that out there.
Yeah. I'd like to take a question from the audience. I have Steve Mears, who's asked a very clever... Oh, there you are, Steve.
Hi, so you spoke really eloquently about the kind of the risks and the downsides, particularly around kind of elections interference. I'm really interested in your thoughts about what we should do about them. And in particular, kind of the urgent challenge, I think, of being able to differentiate between generated and real kind of media. What kind of approaches you're seeing, statistical, watermarking? What do you think about how we should tackle these challenges?
I think the watermarking for text is probably a lost cause. So just to bring people up to the question. So for video, you can stick something inside the video that nobody will see. And there is now a multi-manufacturer effort to have cameras mark when something was recorded, to give you a kind of chain of provenance around it. I'm not as optimistic about being able to do it for text. I think we should try. OpenAI is doing some watermarking so you can tell whether a system was, the text that it created was created by OpenAI. So far, I don't think any of these systems actually work that well. They're not so hard to defeat, and they can be defeated by accident and so forth. It's worth trying. It's also the case that, like, what OpenAI creates is only some small piece of the text in the world. It's a very small fraction. It's a growing fraction, but people create text the old-fashioned way. Do we want to say nothing that I create, on my laptop is valid if I don't go through OpenAI? So you're going to have a lot of stuff that is labeled as created by OpenAI. The bad guys are going to go around that, right? They're going to use the downloaded models that don't have that watermark. And so I don't have a lot of faith in that. Somebody did an analysis of all the tools that have been created recently to discriminate between AI-generated text and human-generated text. And the best ones are maybe like 80% correct, and probably they're going to get worse because the bad people are going to figure out ways around it. There are always going to be these arms races, like you see in spam, where the spammers do some technique, eventually the anti-spammers catch on, and the spammers find something else. And so I'm not that optimistic in the long term about us being able to distinguish between human-generated text and machine-generated text. The way I think we have to go after the misinformation problem is to penalize it. And that runs against the grain, at least of the United States, where people are very into free speech. And I think that we're going to have to bite a bullet and say that if people mass produce misinformation at scale that is harmful and false, then we're going to have to penalize it. I make the analogy to drugs, where we might not prosecute people for possessing a small quantity, but if they're dealing wholesale, then we treat it differently. I think we are going to need laws around the wholesale distribution of misinformation. Excuse me.
Great. And here's a question from Jack Griffiths about how important is open source for the development of AI?
This is a really hard question. So I think
could you give some context around?
Yeah, I'll give you the question, and I'll preface it by saying I've been pretty confident in a lot of my answers, and this one I just don't really know. So here's the controversy. Open source software means anybody can use it, anybody can download it, put it to whatever purpose they want. Closed software, not everybody can edit it, not everybody can see it, not everybody can use it. So the iPhone operating source is basically closed source. I can't just change the iPhone operating system. They keep it closed for security reasons, maybe also for business reasons. So that forces me to go through the iPhone store for apps, and then the people who build the apps have to pay 30 cents on the dollar, and that's not good for them. So the complications around it in both directions. There can be value in open source because people can build on each other and make better and better software. But there's a question: if all of these tools are out there for anybody to use, how bad is the consequence going to be? And we don't have a good handle on that. So in some ways, I feel like it's premature to answer this question. But of course, we're stuck. We have to do something now. And so there's a lot of tension. I think people who tend to think about national security all want to see it closed. And I think people who build open source software are like, what do you mean? You know, it's our destiny that we should all own all this stuff. And then you have this third wrinkle, which is that the technology that we're building right now, and we should have maybe said this before, kind of everybody within some field knows how to build. So it's not like the things that Google and OpenAI are building are that different. And for people who are following the field now, it's not that hard to brew your own. It's not that hard to download, you know, a leaked version and tinker it to your purposes. So there's a lot that even if it's not quite literally open, it's not that hard to recreate. There may be, at some point, ideas about AI that not everybody has that are really important. So, for example, if somebody could do a really good job of combining classical AI with neural networks, what we call neurosymbolic AI, a major advance there might be owned by one individual that doesn't want to share it. And there are ups and downs to that.
Yeah.
Right now, the technology that we have is pretty widely known. And so there isn't even that much to protect. You know, from a business perspective, like you can have your own unique data set or something like that. But what we're seeing is when there's an advance in one company, it's often followed, you know, weeks later or days later. Like Facebook had a thing where you take text and make videos out of it. Google released something, you would know better than I, but like the next day, right? It's like they actually already had it, and they're like, okay, well, I guess ours isn't done, but they put out theirs, let's roll it out. And that's happened in general, like with the search stuff. Like Microsoft pushed their stuff out. Google had been working on this for a long time and thought it wasn't good enough for Showtime. They're like, well, if they're doing it, I guess I'll have to do it too. This is not a great dynamic. Somebody, I can't remember who I'm borrowing the phrase from, had a great phrase, which is there's a little bit of a race to the bottom right now. And that's really disconcerting as well.
Thank you so much for all the questions. I love them. Keep them coming. And if you are in the room, do mention you are in person if you would like to ask a question in person. Now, here's a question from Albert. You mentioned earlier that one of the potential good use cases of this technology would be coding. You know, it might make us quicker, better coders. But Albert is asking, some programmers have stopped using Copilot, which is the kind of coding software, because they feel they become worse programmers. So how do you think this prolonged exposure will affect our ability to do things? You know, will we actually be too reliant on this technology and forget how to do these things?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if the consequence in coding is a lot of what we call technical debt, where people do get lazier, they trust the systems a little bit too much. I mean, especially beginning programmers. Like, the more experience, you know, if people have really been around the block, they might be a bit cynical about it, and they might be a bit more careful. I mean, that's part of what makes a really good software developer is they play the long game. A lousy software developer or beginner software developer is like, I got to get this code working by tomorrow. And the expert software developer is like, some other guy or gal has to fix this like, you know, 20 years later. I want to make sure they have some idea of what I did. And technical debt is like, I make this software work for the demo or the next product shipment, but I know that I have cut corners here and somebody's going to have to fix this later. And I think that using Copilot and stuff like that is probably going to incur a lot of technical debt. Where people write code, it kind of works on the core cases that they're doing, but they're not anymore doing the thinking about where could this break? Where could somebody, for example, stick in a virus here, or make an attack on my software, or what might happen if somebody changes the file format? Is it really still going to work? And I'm not sure that ChatGPT is really thinking through all those cases. Most of what it's doing is kind of like finding the nearest thing in some database, changing a couple words, and that's useful for things like I want to look something up on a website where it's pretty cut and dried. But the more abstract the programming is that you're doing, like you want to control a robot or something like that, the less safe that is to do. And so it'll be interesting to see like the long-term consequences. Like if I just have you go through some coding competition, maybe you go through quickly, but how robust that software turns out to be is actually an interesting question. And let me just pause on one other thing, which is I thought you were going to go a different direction, which is I thought you're going to say some programmers aren't using it because it's stealing programmers' code.
That is a great point.
And this is a really big question that we should touch on, both with the generative images and the generative coding. they're using large databases created by people who didn't know their stuff was going to be used in this way. So yes, if you put your code on some library, you were sort of signing some license that you never looked at. I mean, how many people here have read a complete terms of service in the last, 5 years? Like, I used to read them, I just gave up. So somebody has signed a terms of service that says basically what you're putting here on this website can be used by anybody for anything, but nobody envisioned that that meant it could be used by someone who was going to replace their programming job or their job as an artist. And so we have a big question now as a society about how the programmers whose code is being leveraged, or how the artists whose art is being leveraged, soon will be musicians as well, and so forth, how they should be compensated. And it's not clear existing laws really do justice to the original content providers. And so there's a big question there. There's a big question about what the right answer is, and then how are we going to draft legislation around it. It doesn't feel like the right answer is that the big companies should just be able to take all this stuff essentially for free and not compensate the artists at all, but like, what is the intermediate answer? I don't know.
Yeah, great. I have a question from someone in person. Arunav, is that how you pronounce? Yeah. Oh, great, please.
Gary, first of all, thank you for your time today. My question is about, is ChatGPT or large language models a distraction or a step towards artificial general intelligence?
Well, I wrote this paper called Deep Learning is Hitting a Wall. And Jan LeCun, among other people, got very mad at me. He's the chief science officer at Meta. And he said, no, deep learning's not hitting a wall. In fact, he had a tweet. He said, not only is deep learning not hitting a wall, but self-driving cars aren't hitting walls, and everything is fine and dandy, and Gary is an idiot. He didn't actually say the last couple words, but it was implied.
I bet he thought it.
It was obvious that he thought it. And then I made fun of him with the Tesla running in the jet, because that's how Twitter rolls. So he trolled me, I trolled him. That's, free entertainment for all. But then, that's just background, he recently said, and you may know this, he recently said that large language models are an off-ramp on the road to artificial general intelligence, which, as far as I'm concerned, is a paraphrase of saying that deep learning is hitting a wall. What I meant by deep learning is hitting a wall is there are these core problems, even though it's getting better and better every day, there are these core problems that are not getting solved, which include physical reasoning, psychological reasoning, hallucination, factuality, and so forth. Those are not getting solved. That's why when I made my predictions on GPT-4, I was 7 for 7, because I can see that this technology inherently cannot solve those problems. And if you can't solve those problems, if you can't solve factuality, if you can't actually understand how the world works, you are not going to have an artificial general intelligence that we can trust. You're going to have a pastiche machine that gets better and better and better, but still doesn't really know what it's talking about, and therefore still cannot be counted on. And so yes, I absolutely agree with LeCun agreeing with me. I will accept his friendly amendment in the wording and say, yes, this stuff is an off-ramp. It is not getting us to artificial general intelligence that we can trust. It can't even play a decent game of chess without cheating. How is it going to deal with the real world? How's it going to understand a conversation like this, or whatever it is that you're trying to do in your job today, or whatever? It may help you with a lot of things. Like, we're going to really have a world where humans are in the loop with the machines, and people are going to learn how to navigate these machines and do interesting things with them. But artificial general intelligence would be about AI standing on its own 2 feet, so to speak, if you pardon the metaphor, and really being trustworthy the way the Star Trek computer is, where you're like, I have this problem, go solve it for me. And you don't have to be like, and did I use the right prompt, or is the world going to end because I chose the wrong prompt? I don't think it's getting us there. Another way to put it is, we've been building the same kind of architecture for the last several years. It's not getting closer to this, and there's not enough people doing basic research to say, well, then what should we do instead? People are just like, there's more commercial potential. I'm going to go after that commercial potential. And so you have almost like a tragedy of the commons, where it makes sense for each individual graduate student, let's say, to pursue large language models, because that's where the money is. It makes sense for them individually, but for the collective, I don't think it does. One thing I've talked about in a New York Times article some years ago, and I'd still like to see, is something like CERN for AI, where we try to pursue collective goals rather than individual goals. And the collective goal that I mentioned there was building AI that could really understand medicine for the purpose of drug discovery and solving things like Alzheimer's and so forth, where their problems are just too hard for individual humans to apprehend, because biology has so many molecules interacting, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of molecules. No individual human is ever really going to understand that. So computers could help, but they need to causally understand the physics of the anatomy, the physiology, and so forth. We could say, as a society, enough with the large language models. Let's actually use it. You know, they have some benefits, but a bunch of costs. Let's try to figure out how to build AI to do scientific discovery, to help us with climate change, with medicine, and so forth. And we're just going to reallocate our dollars, or we're going to, or pounds, or whatever. Weird speech error. Cut that from the tape. That does not go in the tape. We are going to reallocate our money, and we are going to use it on AI for the general social good, or we are going to tax all these other things that are maybe not quite as socially good. We're going to tax profits on AI at some higher rate in order to subsidize a broader look at AI, including tools that will help us to fight misinformation, help us do medical discovery, and so forth.
Thank you so much for your question, and thank you, Gary, for ending this on a sort of positive note. That's all the time we have today. Thank you so much for your attention and the amazing questions, and thank you, Gary, for this fascinating session.
Thank you.